Millionaire stunned when silent daughter finds her voice, singing with Black Nanny. Comment from which city you're watching and hit the like button for more videos. Arthur Kane had everything that money could buy, everything except a daughter who spoke. His little girl, Eloise, was 7 years old and had never uttered a single word. Doctors called it selective mutism. Therapists suggested trauma from her mother's sudden death 2 years earlier. But for Arthur, who had built his empire in luxury hotels across 3 continents, none of the explanations mattered. What mattered was the silence, the heavy, aching silence that filled his sprawling mansion long after the laughter of Eloise's mother had vanished. Arthur threw himself into work. He hired specialists, tutors, even speech coaches. None succeeded. Eloise would look at them with her wide gray eyes, clutch her sketchbook against her chest, and retreat into her bubble of silence. Until one evening, Arthur returned home earlier than usual. He had expected emptiness, the kind of echoing quiet that had become his home's signature. Instead, he froze in the marble hallway. A sound, soft at first but unmistakable, floated through the house, singing, not the polished notes of a trained voice, but raw, imperfect, deeply human. A melody that trembled and soared all at once, and layered within that voice, clear, delicate, trembling like the flutter of wings, was another, his daughter's. Arthur's chest tightened as he followed the sound down the corridor. He pushed open the library door just enough to see, and there they were. Eloise sat cross-legged on the rug, clutching a stuffed rabbit, her lips moving, not in hesitant whispers, but in song. Across from her sat Mariah, the nanny he had hired reluctantly 3 months ago, a woman in her late 30s with a history of working in households that the tabloids liked to mock as too rich to raise their own children. Mariah's voice carried the melody, warm and unrefined, the kind that wrapped around a room and made it feel alive. And Eloise, his silent Eloise, sang back in broken little notes, not words at first, but sounds that melted into syllables, syllables into words, words into a fragile harmony. Arthur gripped the doorframe. It was the first time he had ever heard his daughter's voice. The song wasn't from a children's cartoon or a lullaby. It was an old gospel hymn Arthur hadn't heard since his childhood, something his grandmother used to hum under her breath when cooking. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Arthur's throat closed. Why that song? Why did Eloise know it? And why did Mariah, this nanny he barely trusted, choose that of all melodies to draw his daughter out of silence? The sight was beautiful, but underneath that beauty lurked a question Arthur couldn't ignore. Because if Mariah was the key to Eloise's voice, what else was she unlocking inside his daughter's world? Arthur Kane was a man built on control. Every detail of his empire, from the polished marble lobbies of his luxury hotels to the thread count of the linens, was curated with military precision. He believed order created perfection, and perfection created profit. For decades, this philosophy served him well, but his home life was different. His mansion, perched on the cliffs overlooking the Hudson, was immaculate, almost sterile. White walls, gleaming floors, modern furniture. Yet the one space Arthur never entered was Eloise's room. Eloise, his daughter, was 7. She was tiny, for her age, with a cascade of ash-blonde hair and storm-gray eyes that seemed to belong to someone much older. She rarely smiled, rarely played outside, and never spoke. Her world was built from sketches, page after page of drawings she filled in a leather-bound book. Some were whimsical, rabbits, castles, stars. Others were darker, storm clouds, figures with no mouths, houses with no doors. Arthur kept her surrounded by the best specialists money could buy. Therapists flew in from London and Paris. Tutors crafted specialized curricula. But nothing pierced Eloise's silence. The professionals spoke of grief, trauma, a wound too deep to name. Arthur hated those words. He wasn't a man who tolerated problems without solutions. It was Eloise's grandmother who insisted he hire Mariah. "She doesn't need more doctors," the old woman had said. "She needs someone who sees her, Arthur, not her silence, not her illness. Her, Mariah Washington." Was not who Arthur expected. She wasn't polished like the other nannies, no prim uniform, no clipped accent. She was in her late 30s, with dark skin, warm eyes, and a voice that carried both strength and weariness. She wore simple clothes and carried herself like someone who'd seen life in its rawest forms. Arthur distrusted her immediately. She wasn't from his world. She didn't fit the image of a Kane employee. But Eloise's grandmother pressed, and Arthur, exhausted by years of failure, relented. From the beginning, Mariah treated Eloise differently. She didn't coax her to speak or press her with questions. Instead, she entered the child's world quietly. She sat with her while she drew, humming under her breath. She cooked meals and let Eloise stir the pot. She walked with her in the garden without filling the silence with empty words. At first, Arthur thought it was a waste of time, but then small changes appeared. Eloise stopped flinching when spoken to. She began humming along faintly with Mariah's songs. She sat closer, leaning her head against the nanny's shoulder during story time. Arthur noticed. And though part of him was grateful, another part bristled. Why her? Why could a stranger, an outsider, reach his daughter when all his wealth and power could not? There were whispers, too. At the country club, among investors' wives, even from within his staff. Strange choice hiring her, they said. Doesn't quite fit the Kane name, does she? Arthur ignored them outwardly, but the seed had been planted. One evening, Arthur returned home earlier than expected. He intended to review documents in his study, but as he stepped inside, he heard it. The sound that would change everything. Music. Mariah's voice, low and steady, carried an old hymn through the air, and layered with it, trembling but growing. Stronger was Eloise's. For the first time in 7 years, Eloise was using her voice, not to whisper, not to cry, but to sing. Arthur froze in the doorway, his heart pounding. He should have felt joy, relief, but the song's words pierced deeper than he expected. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Why this song? Why now? And why was Mariah the one holding the key to Eloise's silence? It was beautiful. It was miraculous. But underneath it all, Arthur felt something else too, fear. Because what if the same woman who gave Eloise her voice could one day take it away? The days following that first night of singing were electric. Arthur tried to act as though nothing had changed, but the truth was, he found himself lingering in the hallways more often, pausing outside the library door, straining to hear. And he did hear it, again and again. Eloise was singing. Not always clearly, not always fully, but she was vocalizing, breaking the silence that had weighed on her life for years. Her laughter returned too, shy at first, then bubbling and bright. And, always, at the center of it, was Mariah. Arthur's relief was threaded with unease. He couldn't explain it, even to himself. On paper, he should have been grateful, ecstatic even. But he couldn't ignore the whispers at the country club or the wary looks from his business associates. "You're letting her raise Eloise?" one man asked, swirling a glass of brandy. "Bold choice, Kane. Not what I'd call traditional." Others were less subtle. "Careful," one investor's wife muttered, her tone sharp. "Children mirror what they're exposed to." Arthur's jaw had tightened, but he said nothing. He didn't care for their approval. Or at least, that's what he told himself. But their words burrowed deep, echoing in his head at night when he sat alone in his cavernous bedroom. And then, there was the song. That same hymn returned. Night after night, sung in fragments by Eloise and completed by Mariah. The words haunted him. "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child." Why did Mariah choose that? How did Eloise even know it? One evening, he asked. They were in the kitchen, Mariah drying dishes, Eloise humming softly as she drew at the counter. Arthur cleared his throat. "That song you sing," he said casually. "Where did you learn it?" Mariah glanced at him, then back at the plate in her hand. "Church. My grandmother used to hum it. Old spiritual, older than her, older than me." Arthur studied her, unsatisfied. "Do you sing it with Eloise often?" "Only when she wants to," Mariah said evenly. "She likes it. It calms her." Arthur's stomach twisted. He almost asked if Mariah knew the words she was putting in his daughter's mouth. But Eloise looked up then, smiling faintly, and Arthur swallowed his protest. Soon, the outside world noticed Eloise's change. At a family gathering, Arthur's mother leaned down to hug her granddaughter, and Eloise whispered "Grandma" into her ear. The room fell silent, stunned. Tears welled in the old woman's eyes. Arthur should have been proud. Instead, the first words his daughter ever spoke were a reminder. They hadn't been spoken to him. At a shareholders' dinner weeks later, Eloise sang a line from the hymn under her breath as Mariah held her hand. Gasps rippled through the room. A child who had been silent for 7 years was suddenly singing, and with a black nanny by her side. It should have been miraculous. But whispers curdled into rumors. Some called it divine intervention. Others muttered about manipulation. By the time dessert was served, Arthur heard fragments of speculation. She's filling that girl's head with strange ideas. Is this her way of climbing into the Kane legacy? What will the board think if they see the child more attached to the nanny than her father? Arthur's chest burned with shame, though he couldn't explain why. The breaking point came on. A rainy Sunday. Arthur had agreed to host a small charity event at his mansion, a gathering of donors and dignitaries. He wanted Eloise present, a symbol of resilience, proof that the Kane family still embodied perfection despite tragedy. But when the guests arrived, Eloise clung to Mariah's skirt, refusing to let go. Arthur crouched down, whispering urgently, "Eloise, sweetheart, you need to stand with me." She shook her head, lips pressed tight. Mariah knelt, her voice gentle. "Baby, you can stay with me until you're ready. No rush." Arthur's face flushed. Guests watched from across the room, a senator's wife whispered behind her hand. Arthur stood abruptly, plastering a smile on his face. Moments later, the piano player struck a chord, and to Arthur's horror, Eloise pulled Mariah toward the stage. "Sing," Eloise whispered, her voice trembling but audible. The room stilled. Every eye turned toward them. Arthur's pulse thundered, and then Mariah nodded, leading Eloise to the piano. The two began to sing, the same hymn, haunting and raw. Eloise's voice cracked at first, but she pressed on, clinging to Mariah's hand. By the time they reached the chorus, the room was transfixed. Some wiped tears. Others sat rigid, uncomfortable. Arthur couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His daughter, his silent daughter, was singing for the world. But she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Mariah. And when the song ended, the applause was thunderous. People surged forward, congratulating Mariah, praising her miracle. Not Arthur, not his money, her. That night, after the last guest left, Arthur confronted Mariah in the library. "What are you doing to her?" His voice was low, dangerous. Mariah looked at him evenly. "Nothing she doesn't want." "She's my daughter," Arthur snapped. "You're making her depend on you. You're putting words in her mouth. Songs she doesn't even understand." Mariah's jaw tightened. "She understands more than you think." Arthur's hands clenched into fists. "If you're trying to make yourself indispensable." But before he could finish, a small voice cut through the tension. "Daddy?" Arthur froze. Eloise stood in the doorway, her eyes wide. She had spoken to him, for the first time. His heart lurched. But the words sounded fragile, like glass on the verge of breaking, and he couldn't shake the thought. Had she spoken because of him, or because Mariah was there? Rain lashed against the mansion's tall windows, wind howling through the night. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside Arthur Kane's chest. The charity performance had changed everything. Newspapers splashed Eloise's miraculous singing across their pages, but Arthur's name was barely mentioned. Instead, the headlines focused on Mariah, the nanny who gave Eloise Kane a voice. He had built an empire brick by brick, but in a single evening, a woman he barely knew had stolen the light from him. Or so it felt. That night, Arthur made a decision. He would end it. Mariah was to leave. The following evening, he called her into the study. Eloise, as usual, trailed behind her like a shadow. Arthur's tone was crisp, businesslike. "Your services are no longer required. I'll see that you're compensated generously. You'll leave by tomorrow." Eloise froze, clutching Mariah's hand. Mariah's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about what's best for Eloise, is it? This is about you." Arthur's jaw tightened. "She's my daughter. my responsibility, and I will not have her paraded around like some performance act. Eloise tugged at his sleeve, lips trembling. Daddy. No. The word hit him like a blade. She was speaking, pleading, but the plea was for Mariah, not him. Eloise, he began softly, you'll have other teachers, No! Eloise's voice cracked through the air like thunder. No, Mariah. No voice. Arthur staggered back as though struck. Mariah knelt beside Eloise, smoothing her hair. Sweetheart? It's okay, Arthur's control snapped. What are you doing to her? His voice roared, echoing through the study. She was mine before she ever knew you. Mine. Silence fell. Eloise burst into tears, and then Mariah stood, her face calm but her eyes blazing. Arthur, you're blind. You think money fixes wounds, that control heals grief. But your daughter doesn't need a hotel tycoon. She needs a father. And the truth. Arthur stiffened. Truth. Mariah's voice dropped, heavy with a secret too long carried. That song she sings, the hymn. It isn't random. She knows it because her mother used to sing it. Late at night, when she thought no one was listening. Arthur's chest hollowed. His late wife, Claire, had hummed that melody. The memory struck like lightning, jagged and cruel. He remembered, faintly, a night years ago, Claire rocking Eloise in her arms, her voice a whisper in the dark. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. He had dismissed it as nonsense, background noise, never asking why she chose such sorrowful words. Now Eloise was resurrecting it. Through Mariah, Arthur staggered. How do you know this? Mariah's gaze held his. Because Claire told me. Long before you even knew me. The room tilted. What are you saying? I knew your wife, Mariah said quietly. Years ago. Before you. We grew up in the same neighborhood. Different worlds. Same streets. She came to my church once. When she was lost, broken. That hymn was her confession. And when Eloise started humming it, I realized she hadn't forgotten. Arthur's mind reeled. His empire, his order, his certainty, all crumbling. Eloise clung to Mariah, her small voice breaking through the storm. Don't go, please. Arthur's vision blurred with rage, grief, shame. How dare this woman, this stranger, hold keys to a part of his wife's life he had never known? How dare Eloise cling to her instead of him? And yet, underneath the anger, a darker truth whispered. Was it really Mariah he hated? Or the mirror she held up to him, showing every failure as a father? The storm outside thundered, lights flickering. Arthur's hands shook. Get out, he whispered. Mariah didn't move. Not until you choose, Arthur. Do you want a daughter who fears you or one who sings? The words pierced deeper than any blade. Eloise's sobs filled the silence. Arthur's control was gone. The empire builder, the image-obsessed CEO, collapsed into a broken man. He dropped into his chair, burying his face in his hands, and Eloise's small voice carried through the storm. Daddy, sing? Arthur lifted his head slowly. Eloise stood there, her eyes red, her hand reaching for his. The hymn. She wanted him to sing the hymn. His throat constricted. He hadn't sung since he was a boy, long before success had stripped him of softness. But Eloise was asking, begging. He opened his mouth. At first, nothing came. Then, hoarse and unsteady, he sang. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Eloise joined in, her fragile voice weaving with his. Mariah, standing silently to the side, closed her eyes. For the first time, Arthur wasn't singing to the world, or for pride, or for appearances. He was singing for Eloise, and Eloise was singing for him. The storm raged on, lightning splitting the sky. But inside the Kane mansion, a different storm broke, one of grief, truth, and something dangerously close to healing. And as the final notes faded, Eloise whispered one last word, clutching both of their hands. Family. Arthur's heart cracked, open. But what kind of family could survive when its foundation had been built on secrets? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as thunder rolled. The morning after the storm, The Kane mansion felt changed. The marble floors still gleamed, the windows still stretched skyward, but something invisible had shifted. It wasn't lighter, exactly, but it was real. Arthur awoke with a headache from too little sleep. The night replayed in his mind like a reel of film. Eloise's trembling hand reaching for him, her voice weaving with his, Mariah's steady presence like a lighthouse through the storm. For the first time in years, Arthur felt small. Not as a CEO, not as a widower, but as a man who had failed to see what mattered most. When he came downstairs, Eloise was already in the kitchen. She was drawing again, her sketchbook wide open on the counter. But this time, the picture was different. No storm clouds, no faceless figures. Instead, 3 figures stood under a sun breaking through the clouds. A tall man, a small child, and a woman with braids. Above them, she had written one word in shaky block letters. Family. Arthur's throat tightened. Mariah looked up from the stove. She was frying eggs, her face calm, though her eyes searched his. Neither spoke at first. Finally, Arthur broke the silence. I was wrong. Mariah didn't answer immediately. She slid a plate toward Eloise, who beamed. Only then did she say, "She doesn't need perfection, Arthur. She doesn't need another therapist or a spotless name. She needs you to see her." Arthur sat heavily at the table. And you? Where do you fit in? Mariah hesitated. That's not for me to decide, but I promised your wife once that I'd never let Eloise feel alone. If you want me gone, I'll go, but you'll need to be ready to step into the space I leave behind. Arthur stared at her, stunned. You promised Claire? Mariah nodded slowly. That night at church years ago, she told me her greatest fear, that Eloise would grow up in silence, swallowed by your world of walls and glass. She asked me, if our paths ever crossed again, to be a bridge. Arthur's chest cracked open. He had spent years running from Claire's death, burying himself in control, in marble, in business. And yet here was this woman, this outsider, he had dismissed, carrying his late wife's plea like a torch through the darkness. Eloise broke the silence with a small, clear voice. Daddy? Arthur looked at her. She was smiling, a faint but certain smile, her gray eyes no longer hollow but alive. Yes, sweetheart, he whispered. She slid the sketchbook toward him. Sing tonight? Arthur blinked hard. Yes, tonight, every night if you want. Mariah's eyes softened, and for the first time, Arthur allowed himself to meet her gaze without defense. In the weeks that followed, the world's eyes remained fixed on the Kanes. The story of the silent heiress who found her voice became a media frenzy. Arthur braced for scandal, for whispers about race, about class, about whether Mariah was appropriate. And the whispers came. At board meetings, in glossy magazines, in hushed country club corners. Some called it a miracle. Others sneered about manipulation. But Arthur, for the first time, did not let their voices rule him. At a press conference, when asked about Mariah, he looked directly into the cameras and said, She gave my daughter something money never could. And for that, she is family. The room fell silent. And though he knew it would cost him, business deals, invitations, respect among the so-called elite, Arthur felt something he hadn't in years. Freedom. Eloise continued to blossom. Her words came slowly at first, but each was a victory. She sang often, her voice fragile but growing stronger, and she still hummed that hymn, though now it no longer sounded like sorrow. It sounded like remembrance, like love carried forward. Mariah stayed, not as an employee, not as a nanny, but as a guardian of sorts, a bridge between the Kane legacy and the raw, unvarnished humanity that Eloise needed. One evening, months later, Arthur tucked Eloise into bed. She looked up at him, her stuffed rabbit under her arm. Daddy? Yes, love? You listen now. The words were simple, but to Arthur, they were everything. He kissed her forehead, closing his eyes against the sting of tears. For years he had demanded silence be broken. He had thrown money at it, tried to control it, forced perfection into it. But in the end, it wasn't about breaking silence. It was about listening when a fragile voice finally emerged. Arthur glanced at the doorway, where Mariah leaned quietly, watching. He gave her a small nod, not of authority, but of gratitude. The storm had passed. But its lesson remained. Racism divides families. Prejudice blinds communities. But love, the kind that listens, that bridges, that endures, can give voice to even the most silent soul. And in the Kane mansion, where marble once echoed with emptiness, music filled the halls once more.